He came to us after his graduate work at the University of Notre Dame, Notre Dame or Dame? Notre Dame. And he focuses broadly on trajectories of healthy aging. He's focused on purpose in life across the life course at all ages, and how this sense of purpose relates to life outcomes. His fortunate students are in his lab, the PATH Lab, that stands for Purpose, Aging, Transition, and Health. So we're very excited to have him here today to talk about his purpose in life research. So Patrick, with that, you want to take over the screen and get you going? There you go.
Okay, everybody see the slides? Perfect.
That's perfect.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for that great introduction. It's always kind of funny because before coming here, I actually taught at Carleton University in Ottawa. And after getting my graduate degree at the University of Notre Dame, I was then told I've been mispronouncing it the whole time. And the Canadians informed me it was Notre Dame. So I've learned that my university actually does have a couple different names over the years, but it's a delight to get to be here. I think I was part of an Issues in Aging talk about 5 years ago, and it's always great to get to rejoin this group and to share some of the stuff that we've been doing over the last few years. And my goal today is to kind of set things up on 4 main fronts. The first thing that we'll discuss is what does it mean to have a sense of purpose and why I think it matters, and why research shows that it matters for older adults and aging research. We also will then discuss the vulnerability and variability in purpose during adulthood, speaking to kind of the issues in aging part of this. Why is this a concern for us when trying to help promote healthy aging? We'll then get into some of the work that we've been recently focused on how do you cultivate a sense of purpose in older adulthood. And finally, provide some implications for public policy and future research focused on what we all could do to help to reduce obstacles in the path of purpose. What kinds of things could individuals, could programs and institutions do to help older adults maintain a sense of purpose and direction into later in the lifespan? So over the weekend, when I was working on the slides, it was a beautiful spring weekend with beautiful flowers everywhere. So I've got a lot of colorful slides that look a lot different than our current St. Louis weather, which is rather gloomy and rainy. But we'll start off today with discussing what I mean by a sense of purpose. And it's a fascinating construct to study, in part because it means something slightly different to several people. That we do recognize the fact that what purpose means to you, what these words on the screen, how you're interpreting them might be slightly different than how I interpret them, how somebody else in the room interprets them. But there are some general commonalities towards understanding what we mean by purpose, which are important to bring up when trying to describe these ultimate benefits of leading a purposeful life. So I like to start by discussing what this means from like the scientific perspective. So defining sense of purpose, as a psychological scientist, we tend to focus on 3 primary domains for identifying what this means and how we can measure it. The most widely recognized definition of sense of purpose and the most widely used measure in the field comes from Carol Riff at the University of Wisconsin. Carol is a revolutionary in this field, probably the person most responsible for demonstrating that scientists can think about purpose and scientists can understand what sense of purpose does across individuals. And Dr. Riff brings this up with respect to how people with a sense of purpose have goals in life and this sense of directedness. That you may have people who are kind of wandering around in life versus people who are more directed and focused in their life. And Riff's measure picks up on this idea of sense of purpose in terms of having direction and having goals that help you to move from one day to the next. And this comes up in other definitions from the literature, that purposeful individuals have this broader life aim that helps to direct their daily and long-term activities. If your purpose in life is to help others in need, that influences what you do today in terms of your volunteer activities, what kinds of career paths you may take in the future, what kinds of paths in your community you may take in the future. And when I say self-organizing, it helps us to understand who we are too. That when we talk about who am I and what do I want to do in the world, these kinds of identity relevant questions are integral to the idea of purpose and direction in life. And finally, for those of you who might be more familiar with the personality and may have read articles in the news about like how your personality affects this, scientists often think about purpose as being a blend of being like more conscientious, being more organized, industrious, and hardworking, as well as being more extroverted. So it's not necessarily extroverted the way we often think about it, like we're not discussing people who are really talkative or gregarious and outgoing, as much as we are the extroversion piece related to being energetic, related to being active and engaged. So purpose seems to have this goal orientation, this industriousness and organization paired with a drive, paired with energy, paired with a go-get-itness of sorts. And Riff's measure picks up on these things, where you're someone who enjoys making plans for the future and not doing things that seem trivial to you. You're somebody who is an active person in carrying out your plans for the future versus someone who doesn't have a good sense of what you're trying to do. And one thing I want to emphasize from the start is all of this work we're going to talk about today is agnostic to what the purpose is. We are not asking people, in at least the studies we're going to talk about today, what is your purpose in life, or do you have a purpose in life? And that's pretty critical because there may be people in the audience, there may be speakers speaking right now who will have difficulty saying what it is that their purpose is, having difficulty understanding how would I define my goals for life. And with that in mind, it's worth noting all of the work we can talk about today allows you to maybe not need that we aren't focused on, do you have a purpose and can you define it? Instead, we're focused upon this idea of, can you respond to these questions and how much do you agree with these ideas? So that's kind of a very sciencey perspective. The way I like to think about it and talk about it more broadly is that your purpose is providing this kind of compass or this lighthouse. It gives you a direction and presumably gives you a direction you follow. So there's the active piece. And it gives you this thing that you can follow from one day to the next. It's not always the case that we're going to be following our purpose or direction. We often joke that people who are so goal-oriented that they are focused on their purpose every single day might not be the most fun people on earth to be around. Instead, we're talking about something that can fluctuate from day to day, as we'll talk about later, but something you can come back to. That your sense of direction today is going to be pretty similar to what it is tomorrow and the next day, even if you may be more purposeful, say, on the weekdays than on the weekends. So all of that leads to this construct that at once is unwieldy in terms of everybody has a different idea of what purpose may mean. We also have a definition that allows us to compare people and compare people across days. So you have this construct that you may be higher on than me, that you may report greater agreement to those items from before than I do. But we also have a construct that allows us to see from one day to the next, how active are you in carrying out the plans that you set for yourself and so forth. And this is pretty critical when thinking about what purpose can do for aging outcomes. That we're going to see a number of studies that compare older adults who may have a higher level of purpose versus those who have a lower level of purpose. I should note from the start, we don't see a lot of people in our samples who report 0 levels of purpose. There are very few people who respond to those questions saying, I disagree with everything. Instead, what we're really kind of comparing are people who are around the midpoint, like who don't necessarily agree or disagree with those items, to those who strongly agree with those items that indicate greater sense of purpose. Why does this matter for aging? Well, I like to bring up 2 different models of healthy or successful aging that we'll call upon for thinking through today's talk. One of which is a very classic model known as the MacArthur model or the Rowan-Kahn model of successful aging, in which the main goal here from Rowan-Kahn is to emphasize that healthy aging is not just health or not just the absence of disease. Instead, we need to recognize that healthy aging involves a lot more, such as your cognitive functioning, your ability to go from day to day and engage in activities of daily living. Also, your engagement with life more broadly. This is where some of the social elements of aging come in. This is where some of the activity engagement comes in. So even though this model has received its share of critics over the years and fair critics over the years, it's worth noting that this model gives us a first step in terms of recognizing what we would want something to predict if we're saying that it's good or beneficial for older adults. We would want something that can predict outcomes related to health, cognitive functioning, physical functioning, and general engagement with life. Now, again, this is a very sciencey definition. So I also like to bring up a study in which older adults were asked, what does this mean to you? And this gives us some insight into what the healthy aging process may mean in everyday life or to everyday individuals. And what's interesting from this work is, again, health was something that was brought up in most definitions from participants. And that's probably to be expected. If you're being asked, what is healthy aging? Having good health is pretty high up there. But we also see psychological factors, that you have better psychological well-being, you are able to be more optimistic about your day-to-day life and such, that you have roles and activities that engage you. So there's some of that life engagement piece. Finances are mentioned, social relationships are mentioned, and even about 1/10 of the sample mentioned something about their neighborhood as promotive of healthy aging. We're not going to look at your sense of purpose predicting neighborhood factors right now, but that is something we're going to come back to towards the end as to how to help promote a sense of purpose. So we're going to look at one recent study we did that combines kind of the last decade of work that we've been doing on this front. So we have a lot of studies we could propose to show you, but the one we're going to focus on right now comes to us from the Health and Retirement Study. This is a very well-known, long-running study of mostly older adults in the United States. And in our work, we're using a sample that was on average about 68 years of age at the first time point. And what we have here are thousands of participants who completed the sense of purpose scale that I showed you earlier from Carol Riff. And this is a huge advantage to us because so many aging outcomes of interest may require us to look at a very small percentage of people who, have experienced a stroke. We'll talk about that later in the talk, or a small group of people who, pass away by the next time point. So this same study has been used to show that people with a higher sense of purpose were less likely to die by the next time point of the study. And for our purposes right now, it's worth noting there were two cohorts of people who took this sense of purpose measure in addition to other measures every 4 years. So they either started in 06 or 08. They've continued doing this through the years, but most of the studies we're going to talk about today are focused on these first 3 time points. And again, you can see there are thousands of people in this sample from across the United States, which is such a huge resource for us as purpose researchers. Now, what we're going to look at first off is going back to that measure, the extent to which people score high on sense of purpose as a composite, and the composite is scored with these blue items being positively scored, and people who score low on the negative items get a higher score for the composite. But we also want to disentangle this composite into the blue items are going to reflect purposeful. So in the next chart, I'm going to show you a bunch of different outcomes with 3 boxes around them. A general composite, which means all of the items together. A white box, which means just the purposeful items, and the darker gray box, which means the purposeless items. So one thing that you might be asking is it really that people have this active engagement with their goals? Or is it that people who have less purpose or feel purposeless, is that what's really an important part of considering who is less likely to experience healthy aging? And what we did was look at this first at a single time point in the health and retirement study. And across the board, everything that we looked at, we found a significant effect for all 3 of these ways of scoring the measure. So to begin, purposeful people had a higher level of household income. Anything on the right side of this gray line indicates higher levels with higher purpose. The purposeful people tended to do better on word recall, mini mental status test that also examines cognitive ability. And they scored higher on measures of life satisfaction and positive affect. They also tended to be less likely to report health issues. So these are self-reporting health issues. They were less likely to report negative affect or negative emotions, feeling stressed or anxious. And they also were less likely to report depressive symptoms. So some pretty good evidence here that purposeful older adults are faring better across the board. But what's also worth noting is this may be a chicken or the egg thing. What happens down the road? Well, we're actually able to look at this at the second wave of data 4 years later. And we find the exact same effects. So your current level of purpose or sense of purpose is predicting things down the road, like your household income in 4 years, your word recall in 4 years, mini mental status test in 4 years, health, life satisfaction, positive and negative emotions, and depressive symptoms in the future. So this is remarkably strong evidence and backs up a lot of the claims that we have seen over the years, that we've looked at all of these outcomes in different ways in different samples and find that purposeful people do tend to fare better in older adulthood across the board. Why might that be the case? Our work has uncovered a number of mechanisms. First off, purposeful individuals tend to take better care of themselves. So if you're focused on having this big goal, this thing that directs you from one day to the next, you want to keep going towards that thing. So if you want to keep going towards that thing and engaging with it, you better keep yourself in good health. So they experience better health behaviors. They also tend to be less reactive to their daily events. When bad things happen in your day-to-day life, when you have a stressor, naturally you experience more negative emotions due to that stressor. But that's less true for people who have a higher sense of purpose. So they tend to be less reactive in their day-to-day lives, in part because they have this path going forward. So that's how we come up with the name of our lab that Nancy mentioned at the start. We have this notion that purpose provides this path for you from one day to the next that allows you to experience a lot of these positive outcomes across the lifespan. But here in particular, we're talking about older adulthood. So returning to those models, what I like to think about is how does this play out in terms of purposeful aging? Here from the Rowan-Kahn model, we see that it predicts reduced risk for health issues. It predicts a better cognitive and physical functioning, as well as, by definition, purposeful aging is active. It's more engaged with your life. And again, this is just one study from our group. People around the world have found similar things where purpose in life predicts reduced risk for stroke, reduced risk for cardiovascular disease. A group up in Chicago finds that purpose in life predicts things like risk for dementia and Alzheimer's. And when it comes to those things that older adults themselves wanted, again, it's predicting health, it's predicting psychological well-being, social roles, social activities, finances, and we're going to come back to these roles, social relationships, and neighborhood in a moment. That these three factors in particular are going to be things that we call upon when thinking about how to change purpose in day-to-day life. Now, one thing you might be asking yourself is, isn't it just blank? Like we get a lot of work and a lot of people over the years who say like, isn't it just depressive symptoms? Isn't it just being conscientious, being extroverted and so forth? And I can tell you that over the past decade plus of trying to do this work, we have found little evidence that those things outweigh the effect of purpose. Instead, what we're finding is this seems to be a relatively unique thing, that having a purpose-driven life is important. So why is this an issue when it comes to aging? Why is this an issue in aging? It's an issue in part because older adults seem to be more vulnerable for a reduced sense of purpose. Our work shows that over time, individuals often decline in sense of purpose. And one of the reasons may be when they lose these social roles that are important to them in older adulthood. So for instance, I just like to show this figure of some work that I did with a former WashU graduate, Sarah Weston, years ago, where we find these are people's levels of change in sense of purpose over the span of 4 years among those who worked in that health and retirement study. So you see it's a very peaked distribution around 0. People don't change a lot in sense of purpose over 4 years. But if they are retiring during that time, they tend to decline. We're not the only ones who have found this. We'll talk about this more coming up, but it seems to be the case that one factor that may play a role here is that older adults may experience greater vulnerability when they lose their work roles that gave them that thing that guided them from one day to the next. Now, this isn't true for everyone. One thing that we've been doing lately is understanding how retirement looks different across people. So in a nationwide sample of US adults, we surveyed about 2,000 people recently and asked them, and this is a sample across the lifespan, or across the adult lifespan. We asked them, how important are these things to you? Having a strong purpose and direction in your life prior to retirement or during retirement. And what was fascinating is that these two items had almost identical scores, that people generally viewed it as important to have a sense of purpose and direction prior to retirement and during retirement, even though it seems to be the case that retirement might lead you to a lower sense of purpose. So this is really impactful for us because we've been told over the years, like, is it the case that people just want a break in retirement or just want a respite, time to relax and take care of themselves rather than being so goal-directed in older adulthood? Instead, it seems to be the case that individuals tend to report wanting a higher sense of purpose during retirement. And interestingly enough, here we go. It's even the case that the people who want a retirement purpose more are those who are older. So the way we looked at this was taking the difference between the score that you posted out of a 1 to 5 scale for during retirement and a 1 to 5 scale for prior to retirement. And we looked at who scored differently on that measure. It wasn't related to education. It wasn't related to income, extroversion, the big like personality traits. It wasn't related to your health. Instead, what we're finding is that older adults are actually the ones who want more purpose or want more to have a purpose, I should say, during retirement. So this is a really interesting point when we start to think about policy, as we will in a moment. But another thing you might be asking yourself is it the case that part of this effect is due to changes in health status during older adulthood? So what we did in a study with another WashU graduate, Emery Beck, and another professor here in psychology department, Josh Jackson, was we looked at people's changes in sense of purpose over time again in that same health and retirement study, depending on whether they have an event like arthritis or high blood pressure, whether they get diagnosed with a health event versus not. And what you're going to see are a series of things that look kind of like manta rays, in which we have a shape that shows who, again, is around a change score of 0, and people who change 1 point higher on purpose, down to 1 point lower on purpose. So you see, just like we showed you with retirement, there's a lot of people in the middle, a lot of people around 0. And the key here is these figures don't look all that different for people who had a diagnosis of high blood pressure or arthritis during the span of time that we were looking at it. And again, we're controlling for everything under the moon. We are looking at personality, we're looking at psychological well-being, we're looking at health, demographics, background variables, and find that having these events doesn't seem to lead you to a greater risk for sense of purpose change. You might be wondering why these 2 events? Well, it wasn't those 2 events. We actually looked at this across every event we could. And across all of these diagnosed events that people experienced during that 4-year span of time that I mentioned earlier for the health and retirement study, we find that it didn't matter in terms of whether you experienced the event or not, in terms of whether you were more vulnerable to declining in a sense of purpose. So this is really impactful in terms of, once again, showing, like, dispelling a myth that you can't have a sense of purpose in older adulthood, but also dispelling the myth that individuals who experience major health events may not want to feel purposeful or may not want a sense of purpose. In fact, they're reporting as high of a sense of purpose usually, or as much of stability and sense of purpose over time as they do if they didn't experience that event. So given sense of purpose seems to be positive, and given that it seems to be both accessible in older adulthood and something that older adults may desire, how do we actually cultivate it? And this is kind of the $64,000 question. How can we improve sense of purpose in older adulthood? And we're going to talk about a couple ways. And these again come back to the models earlier, focusing this time on how to keep people engaged with life and how to keep people engaged with their social relationships and social roles. So to start with, using that same data set again, my former graduate student, Nathan Lewis, looked at how activity engagement may matter. And if you're thinking about how to improve people's sense of purpose, having them do things that are engaging seems like a great way of going about it. And we looked at things like cognitive activities, reading, writing, word games, physical activities, doing gardening, playing sports or exercising, social activities, attending social clubs, getting involved in political community events. And we looked at people's levels of supportive activities in older adulthood. So did older adults who did more volunteer work, did that help them to have a sense of purpose? And what was interesting here is that across all four categories, older adults who engaged in more of these types of activities tend to report a higher level of purpose. So it's not that one of these things is necessarily better than the other. The key is finding the type of activity that matches with the older adult. So if you're looking at this list, there are probably things up here that appeal to you more than others. And those may be the types of activities you want in order to maintain a sense of purpose and direction. So what kind of evidence do we have of this changing over time? Well, we looked at people's total scores for activities. Since these didn't matter, like it didn't show a huge difference across the activities, we looked at changes in activity engagement within the person over time. So over the years, how much did you increase or decrease? So on the x-axis here, we have people who decreased 1 point up to increased on 1 point. And then we looked at their levels of sense of purpose. And in both of these lines, we see an upward trend that people who engaged more, who had more activity, tended to report a higher level of sense of purpose down the road. Now, what's interesting is the straight line versus the dotted line. The filled in line, what we find is that activity engagement matters more for retired adults than for non-retired adults. So among older adults who are also retired, we find that activity engagement may be a better route or a stronger route to purpose than for people who still have those work roles to engage with. So the first time we're going to take a step away from that health and retirement study is work that we recently did in the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry, in which we looked at a sample of older adults actually from Switzerland. So this study was run by my amazing graduate student, Gabrielle Fund, and she was part of this group that asked people for 5 days. In the morning, what kind of a social engagement did you have? In the afternoon, what kinds of social engagements did you have? And in the evening, again, your social engagements and how positive they were, as well as your sense of purpose that day. So we talked about how purpose can fluctuate from day to day. And what we were interested in here was across the 5 days, is it the case that older adults, so everybody here is 60 or older, is it the case that they are more likely to report a sense of purpose on days in which they experienced more positive social relationships? So what's great about this study is we don't just have 5 days. We have 5 days, and then 6 months later, we had the same adults complete 5 days. And then 6 months after that, we had the same adults complete another 5 days. So this is really key because it allows us to understand that this was not just one unique week, that we can look at across all 15 days. Is it the case that your social interactions predicted how purposeful you felt that day? And indeed they did. So I'm not going to show you all of the complicated models that Gabrielle ran on this front, but we find that individuals who reported having more social activity engagements and more positive ones tended to report higher levels of sense of purpose later in the day. And this builds from both those models of healthy aging from earlier and from past work, considering the fact that to be involved in your goals for life, you usually need others to help you. There are very, very, very few life directions that will not involve engaging with the people around you and connecting with your social peers. So this seems like a critical resource for older adults. And again, I'm going to show you what this looks like for retired versus non-retired older adults. What we find is for those adults who are still in the workplace, yes, there's a positive trajectory upward. That means that for people who had a higher sense of purpose, for people who had more positive daily social interactions, they tended to report a higher level of purpose in the day. But look at this line for retirees. That's a pretty strong effect. That people who reported higher levels of social interactions tended to report much more sense of purpose at the end of the day. So again, it seems to be something valuable for retirees in particular when it comes to what we can do to cultivate a sense of purpose among older adults. So given these potential potential routes, and given the value of purpose for healthy and successful aging, I'm going to point out a couple of implications for policy that our group has found and has suggested in order to help remove potential obstacles to older adults feeling a sense of purpose and direction. The first thing that we're going to talk about is levels of discrimination. My graduate student, Megan Wilson, is doing some wonderful work in the lab right now about how your sense of everyday discrimination, the extent to which you feel that you have been wronged, insulted, or harmed as a result of something about your personal status or personal identification. How does that relate to a sense of purpose in life? And here, we recently did a paper for the Journal of Aging and Social Policy, in which we looked at that same health and retirement study regarding people who reported higher levels of everyday discrimination. What did it look like for their sense of purpose in life? And what you find is, not surprisingly, individuals who reported higher levels of everyday discrimination reported lower levels of sense of care from Megan's results is the participants' race matters insofar that older Black adults in the sample did report lower levels of purpose, but this effect was more muted for this group. And we've seen this in other studies as well, with the suggestion that race matters, of course, in terms of what kinds of experiences you have faced across the lifespan and what kinds of reserves of resilience that you may have built up. So for groups that might not be as likely to experience everyday discrimination, you might find that it holds a stronger impact on you and your ability to experience a sense of purpose or report a sense of purpose because you are less familiar, you are less likely to experience everyday discrimination in your daily life. Instead, even though discrimination is impacting the sense of purpose for Black adults in this sample, it may do so to a slightly more muted extent because of the resilience built up over the years. Megan Wilson is going to be working on this more in her dissertation here in St. Louis, focusing on a sample in which we can tease apart the form of discrimination, the area in which somebody lived in St. Louis, and so forth, in order to really see what's going on here. But the first point regarding policy is to help older adults to avoid experiencing everyday discrimination in order to maintain a sense of purpose. The other thing that our work has been investigating is, what do older adults tell us? So in a study with two of my former graduate students, again, Nathan Lewis and Naomi Reeser, back when I lived and worked up in Canada, we asked older adults there to describe the factors that may hinder your ability to pursue your purpose. And not surprisingly, we do find a number of people mentioning their ailing health. So most of the sample told us stories about how their health may impact their ability to feel purposeful and to function in day-to-day life. But there are certainly ways of being able to address this through support systems in the community. And we talked to the community representative on this front in order to help to produce solutions to feeling purposeful and goal-directed, even when you may be an alien. But the other thing that came up, in over a third of our sample, older adults were mentioning the difficulties with adjusting to a new environment and controlling your move into these retirement communities. And one older adult mentioned how the goals that you have when you're even 60 are nothing like those you have in your mid-80s, that they felt trapped or that they're not going to go anywhere once they were moved into an older adult retirement community. They're pretty much stuck here, and they're not going to do anything world shaking from here. That your goal was, in this case, pretty much to stay alive, which is a very sombering tone to these interviews, but speaks to how important it is to provide opportunities across different living arrangements that allow people to still feel purposeful and still in control of their goals, even when they may be stuck, so to speak, in a current environment or context. And the final thing I want to mention is work from my phenomenal former undergraduate thesis student, Rachel Best, who looked at individuals' changes in sense of purpose over time among those who were fully retired, partly retired, and still working. This is a sample of older adults in Hawaii, and the first row and the bottom row tell the same story we were discussing earlier, that those who were fully retired tended to decline slightly in sense of purpose. Those who were still working in this sample tended to decline slightly in sense of purpose. But what's powerful here is to think about the middle row, that Rachel Best's work here and continuing forward has been integral to understanding how we may reform and reinvent the work system to allow people to avoid a very abrupt cutoff between retirement and between the workplace and retirement, I should say. It's no longer a 0 and 1. It's not a dichotomous variable. Instead, it's something that we can build upon in order to see that if we allow people to transition more softly into retirement, into a more comfortable place, we might be able to help them to maintain and even grow a sense of purpose. One reason why this effect may be occurring is that individuals who are partly retired still have some of the work roles to help them guide day-to-day life, but now have the opportunities for greater activity engagement. Indeed, Rachel Best's thesis spoke to how for partly retired adults, there were some of the highest associations between activity engagement and sense of purpose. So the more we can do from a public policy perspective in order to promote individuals towards this kind of stepwise retirement may be particularly valuable. I'm going to skip past that for now. We've also been doing a lot of work that I can speak to on how we might change perspectives on the future. But I want to conclude to give some time for questions by saying that this is work that really provides insight into why purpose may be valuable for healthy aging, how we may cultivate it, and ultimately how this requires a multidisciplinary approach. That we need to recognize that to help individuals to feel purposeful, it's not just something psychologists can do, it's not just something public health officials or sociologists can do, but building together these opportunities to reinvent social structures at these institutions may be critical for helping to maintain a sense of purpose in older adulthood. And with that, I'll thank our funding agencies that have helped support this work, as well as my two amazing graduate students who are currently here, Gabrielle Flood and Megan Wilson, and all of my great collaborators over the years who have been integral to promoting this work and being able to help us around the world with different data sets. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And yes, I'm happy for any questions or thoughts that the group may have.
Thanks, Patrick, very much. Now's the time to put questions in the Q&A, and we'll keep track of that. An easy one. Can we make these slides available, Patrick,
Yes,
to people that want them? Okay, great.
Yes.
Please put your questions in the Q&A, since we are in a format where we just can't have you ask them unless we can figure that out. But I'll start with the question. And you know, I've asked this before because it continues to be intriguing to me. You are agnostic to type of purpose. You don't care what people say is meaningful or purposeful to them.
So,
So tell me about that, because I get stuck there thinking, is all purpose created equal in terms of health outcome for people or well-being outcome?
yes, so let me say this line of work is very agnostic to what the purpose in life is. And one reason why is when you consider these large data sets like the health and retirement study, we are kind of stuck with the measures they have, that we are extremely grateful that they have this opportunity, that we can look at sense of purpose. But anytime that we have these large data sets, we're kind of stuck with asking questions about how can we create a measure that you, me, and everyone else can respond to in the same way, which is where the sense of purpose measure is so valuable. And some of our other work has tried to tease apart, what does this look like depending on whether your aims are more pro-social, whether your aims are more financial, and so forth. And there's a couple of wrinkles here that are worth noting. One of which is you can sometimes find differences depending on what the purpose is, but it's often in ways that are pretty obvious. Like people who report a more pro-social purpose may experience greater perspective taking, greater empathy and sympathy for others, like outcomes that are very related to a pro-social purpose, more so than somebody who has a more financial purpose. Contrarily, we sometimes see that financial purpose growth can lead to things like greater success and maybe greater success at work. That would be kind of an obvious one. But one thing that is a real challenge is when we ask people to actually tell us, what is your purpose in life? It's such rich data. It's so like, I hate when people get stuck categorizing like, oh, you have a pro-social purpose and you have a financial one. Because usually from even as young as adolescence, we have people telling us these very rich things like, it is my purpose in life to have greater success in the workplace and achieve my goals there in order to support my family, be part of my community, and so forth. And, some researchers will stop at that first point of like, the first thing mentioned was finance or occupation. It's a financial occupational purpose. But so many of us don't have that. Like if I tell you that my purpose in life is to advance science, that might be the start of it, but it's also the community building with people in St. Louis. It's the work that I do with the graduate students. It's being able to talk with people like in this format and share knowledge in that way, that I think it's tricky in terms of trying to answer your question in that regard. There's so many things that comprise someone's purpose. But.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. There's lots of good questions coming in. I'm not sure we're going to have time for them all, but a couple of them relate to differences you see between group differences in your measurements of purpose, men and women, introverts, extroverts. What kind of sort of group differences do you see?
Sure. First off, there is a slight difference if you're looking at binary gender with respect to women do tend to score slightly higher than men on sense of purpose. It's a very modest effect usually, and sometimes it's more even than really a difference there. Another person mentions like extroversion. Extroversion is positively related to sense of purpose. But interestingly, it's usually the components of extroversion that we don't think about. It's like not so much who is more talkative and who is more bubbly and gregarious, as much as it is who is more active and like positive and energized. So some things about extroversion that we as personality psychologists might bring up, but aren't like the common ones we talk about in newspaper articles and so forth. Let me see about other, oh yes, we mentioned there's a question about faith. In terms of religiosity does seem to have a positive association with sense of purpose. And that was one of the things that we controlled for and accounted for in a lot of these analyses. And what's interesting is we've done a number of studies on this front, and you find a modest association between how religious you are or how spiritual. Those are two separate things that have slightly different associations and sense of purpose. But we also find that this may be very strongly impactful for a subgroup of individuals and not as influential on their purpose in life for a large group of people. And that might be what's really describing that, like, overall, it's a modest effect, but it really has a big effect for some people. And that effect kind of gets wiped out when you consider people overall. So there's a couple of things.
Education, one more on group differences.
Oh, yes.
About education.
Education, good question. Education is positively related to a sense of purpose, but it does not wipe out any of the effects of sense of purpose. And there's even some recent suggestion that sense of purpose may be more valuable for people who might have lower levels of education, that it might help to compensate potentially for lower levels of education. But nothing that I showed you today, like what I like to say about it is, it's not dependent on being educated. Everybody can have a sense of purpose and direction, and these effects aren't dependent, and having a sense of purpose is not dependent.
So Patrick, there's some good questions there. I'm going to let you pick what you want to answer in the couple minutes we have left. While you're scrolling through, folks, if you need continuing ed, stay on when we're done, when we sign off with Patrick, and there'll be a QR code for you to take a look at for you to get continuing ed, and we'll leave that up for a minute. So Patrick, yes. What are you going to answer next?
So the last one that I'll focus on today, there's a question here about the advantage of having retirees continue in other roles. And this is a wonderful question. Like, this is something my thesis student, Rachel Best, has been really interested in, is trying to find roles that are similar to what they did in their working life, and helping to transition out of the workplace there. And we've seen this at times with like phased retirement policies here at WashU and elsewhere, of having professors, faculty maintain part of a connection to the community. And there's some great work. Tara Grunwald and others have been part of this long-running study in Baltimore and elsewhere called the Experience Corps study, that is very famous, that they find older adults who are brought back into educational environments may be able to maintain or grow a sense of purpose by helping children, helping teach children math and reading skills. So I think there's a great opportunity here, in particular for us to take advantage of linking what you are doing to what you did, and help to generate purposeful engagement among retirees in that way. So I think it's a great opportunity, and hopefully something we can look at more in the future.